What's the nature of organizations that will attract and hold innovative thinkers? And what's the nature of organizations that lose them? And so I'm going to talk about, just briefly, this idea that when you have a disobedient teacher, how do you survive if you're productively disobedient? Essentially, because most of us will work in damaged hierarchies. And hierarchies actually can become very threatened by somebody who is productively disobedient. Disobedient and not productive is not a threat. But when you actually challenge something that's above you because you're showing higher levels of competence and leadership, it can become a problem. So I want to have a look at this idea to start off with. Teaching in schools have generally been shaped out of an industrial model. And the model is, it helped shape orphanages, the police, hospitals, schools, organisations, many of them that were developed or in their large form in the Victorian period by the Industrial Revolution, so that they've tended to have this idea that privilege exists with one person at the top and then in decreasing levels down to a larger mass at the bottom. And but then you have somebody who comes into that who is maybe more talented than the person second to the top. And the system we're taught to operate is that, if you're really, really good, you can work your way up in the system and eventually you get more influence. There's a very big difference between power and influence, though. Because sometimes you can find people who are seemingly sitting at the bottom of an organisation who are hugely influential in the culture of that organisation. And so inside the wounded hierarchy, when you're operating disobediently, there's a few things that, again, we don't like to talk about in our profession that become tigers. And one of them is professional jealousy. So professional jealousy often occurs when you have somebody in a hierarchy who's at a reasonably high position, who's having to guard that position against the talent of people underneath them. And so what they do is that they hold on to power and then will either diminish people below them, or they will withhold resources, withhold praise. They will borrow the outcomes of that person and graft them onto themselves. And what happens is that for the innovative person, it can become a very toxic environment. And this is why what happens is that they tend to leave. So what happens is those people are not leaders, they're managers, and they run off leaders. So when you find a wounded hierarchy, oftentimes will appear to be managing very well, but very rarely innovate. And so they will try to call people into them, but the people don't stay. The second thing is that true leadership, when you find organizations that are in incredibly good health, they oftentimes have conflicting ideals inside them, but people work as a community. So when you have a look at things like in the 1990s, when New Zealand was going through all its reforms and they were getting experts in to reshape tomorrow's schools, etc., they were imagining a hierarchical system, principals, deputy principals, etc. But at the same time, there were companies like Levi's and Orthobiotech, and then later the startup software companies that had flattened hierarchies. So these companies shot ahead of their competitors because they attracted innovators and then fed them. So they got rid of a lot of their middle management and distributed management out more flatly. And so we became very interested in this because these people were actually in a so-called competitive environment, were being more effective. So one of the situations we know is that in an organization, you will tend to get one of two, if you make them binary, one of two kinds of staffing. In a damaged hierarchy, they will employ donkeys. Donkeys are people that you can use a carrot and a stick with. And so oftentimes people who are threatened, they will employ people who they know will not threaten their position. So they actually do not want high levels of innovation. What they want is compliance. And sometimes, especially if you have a leader who has a voracious ego, they're actually in the position to be fed. And so a stable full of donkeys will do the work, obey, be enticed, or be threatened. And so they can work under a system of compliance and threat. And the reward is allocated out by the manager who's calling themselves a leader. The opposite is when you look at very healthy organizations, they tend to employ tigers by the tail. So it's a little bit like I've seen here, where you get people who have got very high levels of agency and they coexist in an organization. And so oftentimes you're called into an organization, and normally I spend about a week just watching and listening. And you can see, occasionally there's a stable of donkeys, but there's one tiger in there, but they're about to leave. Other times you get a really interesting mix of both, and it works. And occasionally you get in very, very forward-moving companies, very, very forward-moving organizations, and I've seen this also in schools. I had the pleasure of working in one for about 6 years, where it was stacked full of tigers, but they didn't tear each other apart. And the reason they didn't tear each other apart is that although they didn't see the world the same way, they had similar basic values. And they were given a lot of initiative, a lot of room, and when they did things, it was attributed to them. And then what happened was that they also attributed things to other people. So you get a very fertile environment. But that is not actually what a hierarchy will support. That tends to be a disobedient organization, although they tend to have very, very high levels of innovation. So this is the structure that we basically have inherited that we work in. We believe we work in a hierarchy. So this is the nice standard model. We understand it as a triangle, and the higher up you are, normally the more access you have to information and power. And so people are at the bottom are told that you can, if you want power and influence and information and resources, that you must be quiet and behave yourself, comply and perform well at that rate, and then we will lift you up to the next one and the next one. Now, occasionally somewhere up there, you will have somebody who's actually a tiger, and they will tend to, or a more of a disobedient person, and they will actively start supporting. They operate more like a coach than a manager. So they will start supporting people below them. They're not afraid to grow talent. In fact, one of the arguments we have is the sign of a great leader is that they develop people of greater ability than themselves. They have that skill. But oftentimes they're not sitting at the top. But this idea of the hierarchy is actually an illusion. Because in truth, what a hierarchy actually looks like is something like this. So what it is a very complex network of relationships, hostilities, memories, aspirations, and power. It doesn't work the way the textbook tells us. So you go, how do I navigate something like this? So when they look at disobedient thinkers who become very effective, what they find is it's not actually about the exercising of power, it's the exercising of influence because people like them and trust them. And so they can be at any place in that system, but they influence influence based on trust. So people don't follow them, they want to be with them. So it's a difference. It's not the idea that you're taking, people would go, oh, my team, and you go, your team. So in that statement, you just say something about the way you really see that. So oftentimes you'll get people, the pseudo-leaders, who'll go, you're asking them, talking about the environment, they'll go, my team, or my kids, or my whatever, but they never mention another person by name. They never mention another person by name. It's actually still a heroic model, and they use share. It's like people who go, today we're going to do da-da-da-da-da, and it actually goes, today I've decided that the group is going to do da-da-da-da-da-da. And so they're the sort of people that when you're in a meeting and they're asking for ideas and there's an idea they don't want, they say, thank you for sharing that, and then they move on. Okay, we know that. Okay. So what happens is when we're trying to carve this out for ourselves, we become very valuable in that system because we can support other people inside it. So we don't become alienated. Because one of the most toxic things to a disobedient leader, the thing that will kill them off is if they become alienated, if they don't develop some kind of network around themselves. So the system that we're in is one that elevates performers and reporters. So these are people who can make sure that what they're doing is seen and named, and they can report well on stuff. But that's actually not necessarily the sign of a leader. That's not the sign of someone who has influence. It is a sign of somebody who has strategy for surviving in a certain system. So the people who endure with influence, they are more concerned about how other people are seen in the organization. But what we know is people will gravitate to them. They will listen to their opinions. They will be with them because they know that they'll be listened to in turn. So we have an interesting situation. So in a damaged hierarchy, this is the kind of thing that you get happening. You get micromanaging of people. That's actually driven by anxiety and low trust. It's the belief that anybody below me cannot, unless I am monitoring them, they cannot be doing their job. Second one is that they set up strategies for risk aversion. You go, look, it's very nice, you can be a token, but please don't push this too hard. We'll laugh and joke about you and tell you you're special, but don't rock the boat too far. You can do it cosmetically. But they set up everything to stabilize the organization, not to turn it dynamic. The third one is there's very low trust. These are very low trust. Damaged environments have very, very low trust of people. And this is why you took under a neoliberal system the idea that once a year you come in and you report on your performances or review them, which goes, here's the set of 6 things you said you were going to do. Remember, at the end of the year, you're going to be in here and I'll have you on the mat. We may do this nicely, but this is what's happening, and we will report on these. The opposite is someone who goes, what's the aspirations we've got? You've got, how can I help you? And the term, how can I have your back? So I know the system, I'm here in the system. How can I have your back so that you can do what you need to do? So these are very, very different models. This same anxiety occurs in learning, where we set up assessment criteria that people will be measured against. This is the opposite of trading beyond experience. This is risk aversion. All these things belong in the same realm. So you can find them happening in a stagnant company or a stagnant organization. And this is why the anxiety around teaching, because we're growing the intellectual health of our country. And we've got people who are actually very rich as thinkers operating in this might actually describe the organization in which you're working. And yet somehow you have to be able to empower people within that and the kids with whom you're working. So we come up to a couple of points. This is a big one. We have a belief in New Zealand, which has become now a dangerous myth, which is that somehow we're intuitively, just innately creative, innately innovative. You know, creativity is not a national attribute. It's not. You have to grow it. You have to grow it. We had an education system that was very, very child-centered, understood things like play as very rich area for innovation and agency. And we have got now to a situation where we have students coming into universities who are asking, the first thing they're asking for is the criteria for assessment. They're managing very, very high levels of anxiety and depression because they have been measured by success. They have this concept of success, and it's singular, and it's limited, and it's tied to performance. Whereas, in fact, we know that when we're successful at stuff, that's part of a process that has failure and recovery sitting in it. But that's been excluded from them. And so you have teachers coming into a profession who feel that they have to produce an unrelenting progress of success. If we do not change the education system in this country, we are actually in a crisis because the number 8 wire doesn't exist in our gene pool. Sorry, no more than it exists in anybody else's gene pool. It happens as a consequence of having an environment, some of the education system and some of the system outside that, that was more relaxed about the way, I don't mean relaxed meaning inattentive, I mean relaxed about embracing diversity. We had a system that was much more fluid. As we've locked down into something more systematized, this becomes further and further away. When you disobey, when you set up those micro-environments inside the schools, you do a really important thing. You're working against a tide that has to turn. It has to turn. Here is where we talk about turning the tide. In our classrooms is where we turn it at the chalk face for kids. We cannot go on with this myth if we're not resourcing it. And the next one is this. There's this idea at the moment which has been tossed around that we're going to be saved by technology. Okay, it's a very, very dangerous idea. So Tom Standage, who wrote about a thing called chronocentricity, and so a lot of discourse around technology, if you ever look, they're all saying the same thing, that technology doesn't save people, doesn't save nations, it doesn't save education systems, it doesn't save societies. It doesn't. What it is the critical use of technology or the critical non-use of technology and human beings. So let me give you an example. When, if we look historically at some technologies that we imbued with the power of social agency, so when the telegraph first came, the general belief was it was going to bring world peace. World peace was going to happen because we were going to be able to talk to people all over the world, and it would be the end of war. Another technology that had the same claim on it was public transport by aeroplane, because we'd be able to visit people in all these countries, and we'd become like a big world family. Okay, within 10 years, we were dropping bombs on Hiroshima from that technology. And today, cybercrime and cyberbullying can trace its whakapapa back to the telegraph. Those things, technology doesn't live. It's a thing generated by human beings and used by human beings. Human beings are at the center of the equation. Increasing the software capacity or the range of technologies in schools does not save the social condition of your country, nor does it enhance the intellectual flexibility and creativity of your country. It may help in certain things like your digital camera, your cell phone, those things enable a kind of fluidity, but it doesn't improve the human condition. The human condition is improved by human beings. If you want to improve that, you have to resource that in your society, and you have to resource it critically. And you certainly don't establish a myth which says if we pour money into technology, we're going to fix this. You pour money into people to fix things. And there's a reason for that. The kids we're working with are on a really interesting time between 6 and 16. That's a time when they are scrambling for identity. So as a being growing up, they are moving from the time when they were a child with their parents protecting them to becoming a full identity. So they're doing a lot of questioning. So they're also extremely vulnerable. So when we sell ideas to them like you have to be connected, you have to be part of a network, we can sell commodities off the back to that become sucked in and used as their identity. And so if you don't use the technology critically, you get people who become slaves to a manufactured identity that they have to keep, an online identity that they have to keep resourced and fed in companionship with their embodied identity. But this one's really interesting because it's sanitized. So you take 6 pictures and you pick the best one of yourself. And you have to operate that in a tyranny of joy, where you are universally interesting, beautiful, active, happy. So the fact that you have a pimple in this world sits on your embodied identity. Here it's taken out in Photoshop. The fact that you have the flu exists in this identity. Here it's just not an entry on Facebook. So I'm not slagging Facebook. No technology is inherently bad or good because you can use Facebook. I have a niece who a few years ago they were married. They're just young kids. They had she got pregnant, it was her first baby, and she was told by the doctors it would live for 1 hour after it was born. So she was given she and her husband were given a very difficult choice. A hard thing, heartbreaking when you watch it. And I saw the other side of this. Through that, they decided to keep the baby, even though they would just hold it for 1 hour. And Bella grew inside, and she had a community of friends across Facebook who were this magnificent support all the way through the journey. So the grief process and the joy process were able to play out across all those months. And when Bella was born, they held her for 1 hour and they took photographs, and then she died. But their recovery was phenomenal. Now that was Facebook. So on one level we go, yeah, it does all these terrible things. A technology can be both things. The thing that connects it, the thing that activates it is the human behavior around it. It's the human behavior, that's what we have to focus on. But within that environment that we face another issue is if we don't equip kids with the ability to discern between truth and glamorized rhetoric, they become very vulnerable. So we can have world leaders come to power, who in fact do not use truth. They use persuasion and rhetoric. And that's why they use that environment, because that environment, remember, is put together based on whether you like something, whether you can frame something up in a palatable way or in a provocative way. But being able to discern what's truth and bullshit is really, really important. Really important. And so when we keep banging on and going, we will emphasize literacy and numeracy. If you released a child today into the world, who was good at maths and reading and writing, they'd crash and burn. They wouldn't survive. One of the one skills we don't talk about in this is the ability to discern between what is quality and what is rubbish, because that's something that will save your nation from going to a war that you shouldn't be in. That's something that helps you see when part of your population is becoming poor and you don't listen to the rhetoric anymore. You go, but I can see what this is. So it's a hugely important skill. So what can I do? Well, this is just some personal views, but this is what I've kind of found myself. The first one is this. You have to care for other people who think in disobedient ways, even if you don't agree with them. So when you see them standing on their own, even if you don't agree with them, it's really important to take them seriously. It's important to go and have your cup of tea with them. It's important to tell them, to make sure that they're not alone, because what happens is you become seen as an agent for that. They're seen in an environment. So if you don't care for thinkers like you, what happens is you end up with professional loneliness, and then you can be picked off very quickly. One of two ways. You're either made into a token, and they go, oh, but she's so creative, isn't it wonderful? But don't mimic her because it's just her. You're never going to change something with her. That's the way we disable innovation. We singularize it and then neuter it. So when you don't let that happen, you go, actually, that might be the way you see me, but have you just seen what Cheryl Baskin has done in her classroom? It's amazing. I don't know how the hell she does that. So you actively are promoting and pulling forward other things so that other people are appearing in the scope of disobedience as productively disobedient. It's much harder to manage you in a wounded hierarchy. The second one, refuse. Absolutely refuse to relinquish agency. Absolutely refuse it. So while we may do this in an organization like this, it also happens at the chalk face. Cynicism is the death of power. Sorry, the word didn't want to come. It's the death of power. It's the death of being able to change anything. The kind of people who do that, if you look at them, they don't change the world around them. As soon as we go, I cannot do anything about this, we don't do anything about it. It's a hugely important thing. And sometimes you're going to be there by yourself. Sometimes you'll be there and you just have to look for the other people who are refusing to relinquish it. The third one, sometimes the changes we make are very tiny. And they're done sneakily, because that's sometimes a way to survive. I know you're probably going to go, this is a moral creep up here. But let's be honest, how many times have you closed your classroom door to do something? The power of the viral is huge. That book originally was called Virus until the publisher said that's not a good idea. But it's actually, you'll see the word virus is all the way through there. And it's from the first draft. Because I've actually found that sometimes when you're very alone, when you're in a minority, sometimes the stuff you have to do is viral. You have to look at something and infect it with something quietly, positively more effective that will work better. And then when it does, make sure that effect, that positive effect, is attributed to somebody else. So you operate like a virus. You're less likely to get hit. Viruses tend to survive fairly well. You less likely to get hit, and especially when you're working under stress, those little things, they count. Every little thing counts, because if it's good, it spreads. It's a natural nature of human beings to be attracted to things that work. And the last one is this. There's a lovely word, was a word we use, I've heard it a few times at the conference, but oftentimes we don't understand where it comes from or what it actually means. The word enthusiasm didn't actually mean rah, rah, rah. It talked about something inside of you. The word enthusiasm comes from two Greek words, en theos. It means inner God. It is the inner God inside you that will not die. It is the resource and light that allows you to go into the darkness of a damaged organization or into a conflicted situation and still relentlessly, resiliently burn. And in so doing, light the fire in other people. Or if it's damaged, give fuel to it or oxygen. It's the most precious thing inside you, the most precious thing. And it's the thing that enables you to create change. Kia kaha. Thank you.